Live. So good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from, everyone. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. For those joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And we are really excited because right now we are joined by 5 classes from across North America, and I'm going to give them a chance to do a bit of a shout out before we get underway. So we have Mr. Smith's grade 5s in Oakville in Ontario. Let me just pull up your mic. Hi, guys. Welcome in. Hey, I like the lighting in the class. It's like cool and shadows there. Awesome. Welcome in. We've got Miss Huxley's grade 5s in Brampton in Ontario. Hi, guys.
They're currently at nutrition break.
They're coming. They're coming. Well, we'll say hi to you then. We've got Miss Short's grade 7/8 in Sarnia, Ontario. Hi, guys. Let's check in. Hey, they can hear us. We can't hear you, but that's okay. Something had to go wrong. Welcome in. We've got Miss Gill's grade 5/6s in Cambridge in Ontario. It's an Ontario Day today. Hey, welcome in. And last but not least, still getting their mic working, I think, but maybe they got it. Miss Burkett's grade 5s in Sterling in Virginia. We're going to wave at them anyway, even if their mic's not going right now. Hi, guys. Welcome in. Now, of course, the reason you guys are all here today is for our speakers. So we are joined live in beautiful Los Angeles, California, where we all wish we were this winter, by John Lynch. So a lot of our sessions deal with incredible wildlife, incredible things out in the wild. But we've never really done a session covering some of the amazing creatures and organisms that live inside you. So today we are going to go on an exploration with John on the microbiome, the many, many bacteria that live inside your body, what they do, what we're learning about them, and more. So without further ado, thank you so much for joining us, John, and take it away.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, as Jesse said, thanks so much for introducing me. My name is John. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the creepy crawly, but not so creepy crawly little things that live inside and all around you. So let me just give you a quick share. So today, as Jesse mentioned, I'm going to be talking about something called the microbiota. So you may have heard a little bit about this either through the news or through talking to other people. I'm going to try to distill it down a little bit to make it a little bit even more approachable. Realistically, my talk is going to be labeled a little more accurately. You are a walking, talking bag of bacteria. So have any of you ever heard of bacteria before? Raise your hand if you've heard of bacteria.
A lot of hands.
A lot of hands. Yeah, that's really cool. Bacteria are really, really, really small things. So does anyone have an idea? Like when I say small, do I mean, like an acorn size or a squirrel or a dog or, a grain of rice? How small do you think bacteria are usually? Are they? Tell me when to stop.
Let's see. The pictures are supposed to be coming up. They're not right now, John, unfortunately.
Okay, that's all right. So to give you a scale of things, if you were to hold the smallest thing you could ever imagine, this bacteria are typically even smaller. So bacteria are usually on the order of about 1/1,000,000th of a meter wide. That's something so small that you definitely can't see that with your naked eye. So we need to use really high-powered either scientific techniques or microscopes in order to see bacteria. Bacteria are usually made up of individual cells. So if you've heard about organisms and cells and things, cells are basically the smallest living things you can imagine that can exist. Things like people or trees or dogs or cats are made up of billions and billions of cells. Bacteria usually live as individuals, so they're only one cell at a time. However, because they're so small and they can divide really quickly, they can do some really cool things, even being one cell. So I'll show you a quick video if I can. So if you look at this video of a single cell of bacteria growing over time, you see it starts off as just one thing or just a few cells, and then they end up dividing and making more and more bacteria. And over the course of just a couple hours, so you see here about 300 minutes, you go from one individual cell to being hundreds and hundreds. And this keeps happening over and over again. So really, even though they're really small individually, selectively, they can be really large amounts of mass and size and things like this. And they can do really important things. So when you think about bacteria, you might think about them being I think about bacteria as lots of different things. A lot of times people think of them as one individual thing. And realistically, there's so many different types of bacteria, we don't know about the vast majority of them. So most of them are still mysterious to them. And not even that we haven't been able to find them, but even if we do find them, we can't grow them in our lab. So it's really hard to study them. This is some of the things that I'm working on right now, is trying to figure out how to grow bacteria, how to work with bacteria, how to study bacteria, so we can understand all the cool, interesting, and important things that they can do for us. Now, I asked you if you've heard about bacteria, and it seemed like a lot of you had. If you've heard about bacteria, do you think they're good or bad? So raise your hand if you think bacteria are good.
A few hands.
Yeah, I'll take it, okay. Now raise your hand if you think bacteria are bad. So I see some little bit of wavering, like maybe both. Okay, raise your hand if you think that they are both. Ah, yay! That's what I like to see. I like to see some nuance in the discussion. So realistically, like a lot of things in life, it's complicated. So bacteria can be both good and bad. They can be neither good nor bad. They can be good, they can be bad. And realistically, it kind of depends. So like I mentioned, there are lots and lots of different types of bacteria. We understand what some of them do. We don't understand what most of them do. And usually the ones we hear about in the news or from other people, we think about some of the bad ones, the ones that make you sick. But realistically, kind of, it's hard to label them all with one brush. So I'm gonna give you a few different examples of some of these different types of bacteria that may be either good or bad or neither, depending on how you think about it. So one of the bacteria I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about is called Vibrio fischeri. This is a microscope picture of Vibrio fischeri cells. If you see here in the bottom, that little white line is, again, 1/1,000,000th of a meter. So it's a really, 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 really small thing we're looking at here. And Vibrio fischeri lives in oceans all around the world. So oftentimes, if you go to ocean water, you scoop up some water, you can look under the microscope or using some scientific techniques, you can find Vibrio fischeri. Even though it lives in water, a lot of times it can also live with certain animals. So an example is it can live inside this animal called the Hawaiian bobtail squid. And in this case, we think of this as actually a good relationship. So you think this bacteria, Vibrio fischeri, helps the squid because Vibrio fischeri is able to make light. Now this is super cool. And it's kind of, we think that the reason Vibrio fischeri lives inside the squid or lives inside fish and it makes light, the reason I think that this might be a beneficial thing to the animals is because these animals are oftentimes nocturnal. Now, if you're nocturnal and you're swimming around in the water and something is on the seafloor looking up at you, you might make a shadow, and that shadow might make you an appealing sort of dish to eat. However, if you have a bacteria inside you that makes light, it helps hide your shadow a little bit. So now all of a sudden this bacteria, which again is living in oceans all over the place, once it associates or once it lives inside an animal, it might be able to help that animal live in kind of a normal and healthy way. On the other hand of things, we have bacteria like this Borrelia burgdorferi. So this bacteria is called a spirochete. Spiro, you might be able to guess it's because it has this really cool shape where it almost looks like a spiral. The cells are kind of wiggly wobbly, right? Now this bacteria, even though it's about the same size and doesn't seem, if you first look at it, all that different from Vibrio fischeri, causes a disease called Lyme disease. This is a really big deal if you've ever heard about anyone getting this. It's a very serious disease. It is sort of treatable in a lot of cases if you catch it early enough. But this bacteria also lives inside organisms. It also lives inside animals. In this case, it lives inside animals like ticks and humans. Inside the ticks, it can live and sort of thrive for a while. And then those ticks are able to bite humans and transmit the bacteria. So again, this is a bacteria that lives inside animals, but instead of being beneficial to the animal like it is for Vibrio fischeri, this bacteria might cause disease. And I don't want to make it sound like every bacteria is either good for an animal, bad for an animal, good for a plant, bad for a plant, something like this. Because sometimes they might be one of those things, but realistically, we study them because they do cool stuff. So an example of that is Listeria monocytogenes. Now what I'm looking at here, this is a picture of a microscope, or this is a microscope picture of a mammalian cell. So this is a cell we can study in lab. And then inside the cell are these little red dots. These little red dots are the bacteria, the Listeria bacteria. Now, if you might notice, every one of these little red dots has a little yellow trail behind it. And the microscope picture here, the researchers were able to label part of the mammal cell with yellow. And it just so happens that these bacteria are able to take part of that mammal cell, so part of the cytoskeleton or the structures around the cell, and use it to push themselves around the cell. So they're able to both live inside cells, but also use part of those cells to make something called an actin comet. Comet because it looks kind of like a comet you see in the sky, right? Now, this is kind of hard to visualize what this actually means. So I'm going to show you a quick video of what that looks like. So if you look at these bacteria swimming inside one of these cells, you can look and see how these comets might affect their behavior a little bit better. So again, this is looking at a video where the outside of this is this mammalian cell. These little black dots are the bacteria. And if you notice, they're moving around. They're swimming around inside the host cell. When they're doing that, they are taking, again, part of that cytoskeleton, so part of the structure of the cell they're living inside, and they use it to push themselves around. And then you can see even these little tails behind the bacteria they're chasing around as part of the comet tails. So even though this is kind of, I guess, people will study these bacteria because they do cause some sickness in some people, it's also really interesting just to think about how a bacteria can live inside an entire cell, treat that kind of as like, it's almost like this is the house of a single bacterial cell, which is just maybe one of our cells. Now, if there are lots of different types of bacteria, they're really, really small, it's really hard to see them. Do you think that they live kind of everywhere? Or do you think they live very specific places? Let's see, raise your hand if you think that bacteria live, let's say on a table. Let's say that you think bacteria live on the desk in front of you. Okay, do you think bacteria live in bathrooms? That's true, a lot of bacteria live in bathrooms. Do you think bacteria live in snow? Do you think bacteria live on the moon? I see that one hand that's staying up the whole time, so that's why I asked that one. So realistically, you might be able to guess from the way I'm asking this question, bacteria can live kind of everywhere. So we know a lot about bacteria that live in the oceans or live in soil. We also find that bacteria live in air sometimes, so they're traveling around on small particles, so they can live high up in mountains. They can also live in things like snow. In addition to that, they can live kind of what I think of as more extreme environments. They might live in either places that are really, really hot and really, really humid, like jungles. They can live in and on plants. They can even live in places where we don't usually think about things living at all. So like hot springs. And that's really been one of the cooler things that microbiologists have been able to find, is that there are a lot of really interesting bacteria that live in places where nothing else can live. But it's almost impossible to find a place where we can't find bacteria. And that includes even things that I used to not think about having bacteria, like animals. Now, it's interesting to study the bacteria that live in and on animals. I'm going to try to describe an animal that I find very near and dear to my heart. So bacteria live on animals like people too. In this case, they live on every surface you can imagine for a person. So I'm showing you a picture of my face. This is one of my better pictures. Bacteria live all over my face. The bacteria that live on my forehead are different than the bacteria that live on my nose, the bacteria that live in my mouth, and bacteria that live in my ears. And we've been able to study those bacteria at different places on people's bodies. So again, as you can see, I'm not an artist, I am a scientist. This is the best I could do. But if we look at different places on my body, you'll find all kinds of different bacteria. And it's really interesting to study how those bacteria might influence my body. So really important to think about is that even though, we kind of, especially historically, have thought about bacteria as being bad for people, bacteria live all over us, both on the outside, which you might be able to imagine, like in your hands and your face, but also inside of us. So to get to what I mean by that, one of the places with some of the most interesting and densest populations of bacteria are in our gastrointestinal tract. So basically the path that food takes when it goes from our mouth to the toilet. So if you actually count the number of bacteria that live even in our large intestine alone, so just in the lower part of our gastrointestinal tract, you'll find that there are about 10 times as many bacteria living inside our large intestine as there are human cells in our entire body. So that means that if you just laid out every cell that lives in your large intestine, you counted them, and then you took every single cell in your body, you would end up being much more bacteria than human being, which if you think about it is kind of a trippy thing, right? Like, I don't think about myself as being a culture tube for a bunch of bacteria, but realistically, you're kind of, depending on your perspective, you might be more thinking about yourself as a house for a bunch of bacteria. And not only do we have lots of one type of bacteria, but as I mentioned before, there are tons of different types of bacteria, and we end up having a hugely diverse, so hugely varied group of bacteria living inside each and every one of us. Not only does each person have lots of different types of bacteria, but if you look at yourself today versus yourself tomorrow, their bacteria would change a little bit. And if you looked at yourself versus, let's say, a brother or sister or a parent or a best friend or the person who sits next to you in school, they would also have different bacteria. So there's a huge amount of complexity and really complicated stuff going on inside of us that we're just now learning how to study. The bacteria that live inside us and with us, so like I said, I'll just say on the outside of our bodies and on the inside of our bodies, collectively we call them the human microbiota. So this is a really cool new hot topic because we want to understand how these really, really huge numbers of bacteria with a huge number of differences affect our bodies and how they interact with us. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what the microbiota actually does. Like you might think, okay, I'm covered inside and outside with bacteria. Does it really matter? Does it do anything? The answer is the bacteria we study the most, which is just in our lower intestine, or largely in our lower intestine, even just looking at those bacteria alone, they do tons of stuff for us. So if we look at just a sort of a blow up of a part of our large intestine, and you looked at the different bacteria. So this is just showing an example of 3 different bacteria. The bacteria not only interact with one another, so they might share some different things. They might say, but they might break down something that another bacteria can't break down. So they'll share some nutrients. They also might compete for certain nutrients. So we know there's like very, very important things that a lot of different bacteria want to be able to use. In addition to be able to compete or cooperate or work together or work against each other, we also know a lot of these bacteria can directly interact with the human intestine itself. So they can actually interact with the host that they live inside. And with regards to what kind of interactions those have, a lot of bacteria do a lot of things for us, including being able to break down parts of our diet that we can't digest. So I hope that you eat a lot of vegetables. And if you do, there's actually a lot of those vegetables that we physically cannot digest, but bacteria that live inside our intestines can digest. So if we didn't have our bacteria, we wouldn't be able to process these nutrients in the same way. Not only would that mean we don't get as much energy from them, but also would mean that we wouldn't be able to make certain vitamins and things that are really important for us to stay healthy. So this is something we're now trying to study, is exactly how we can use bacteria to help us digest and break down certain types of food more in a healthier way. In addition, and this is something that I really was surprised by, a lot of the bacteria that live in and on us can help us from getting sick. So kind of historically, people have thought about bacteria as being bad. So you think about things like antibiotics and using them and using hand sanitizers. And those are important in a lot of different ways because, like I said, and over the course of human history, bacteria have been involved in making a lot of people very, very sick. However, we're finding out now that if we misuse those types of things, so if we misuse antibiotics, or if we use them when they're not appropriate, we actually might be wiping out some good bacteria that are helping prevent bad bacteria from getting inside of us. So this is something now where it's really, really exciting because we're trying to basically understand something that's opposite of what we've historically thought about bacteria, which is that not only are bacteria not good, not only are bacteria not bad, they're good, and they also help prevent bad ones from interacting with us. If we go back to just looking at our human body overall, one of the really, really cool things, and this is something that my research is now working on, is that bacteria can also influence things like our brains. Now, this was very, very surprising to a lot of people because in this case, I'm talking about the bacteria just that live in our normal or in our larger intestine. So if we look just the bacteria live in our large and small intestines, even those bacteria that are fairly far away from our brains, sort of spatially, those are able to influence how we think sometimes, how our neurons develop, and how we're able to do things like feel. Now we're even finding they're able to think or to affect things like neurodegeneration, so diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's, or even sometimes developmental disorders, which is really interesting because now we're thinking of this as a new way to treat certain conditions that seemed to be completely disconnected from the microbiota until a couple of years ago. So just a few takeaways from all of this. Hopefully I've convinced you that tiny, tiny things can have big impacts, especially on our lives and the world around us. But there are lots of different types of bacteria. So here I showed you 3 examples. I didn't actually show you any examples that normally live inside healthy people. And that's because they don't have as good pictures usually. But realistically, those are much more important for your day-to-day life. And without bacteria that live in and all around us, our world would be incredibly different. So bacteria can live in any environment we will find. I think I saw a paper recently that found a place that didn't have bacteria and it shook the world because it was the first time people have been able to find this. But even then, it's a really, really impressive the different ranges of places that bacteria can live, including places that we didn't previously think would allow for life. And realistically, the bacteria that live in and around us, again called the microbiota, are super complex. They also know that they're having a lot of different and surprising effects on our day-to-day lives. So a lot of researchers like myself are now trying to figure out exactly which parts of the microbiota or what things the microbiota are doing influence us on a day-to-day basis. And again, because our long-term goal is to figure out how we can help the microbiota improve human health. And so with that, it's a lot of fun talking. If you have any questions, I'd be totally happy to answer them. Thank you for listening. And also, one thing that's important that I wanted to say is that if you have any questions that either you can't think about right now or you don't have time, please email me. I love to respond to questions or look up things or to send you more cool videos of bacteria growing and things like this.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that, John. What a great presentation. And you can also send that email to me. I'll pass it to the classes, make sure that everyone has it so you guys can email more when we're done. But let's dive in with questions. In addition to our classes that are joining live with us, and everyone's here, which is great. Seems like all the mics are working. We have at least 4 other classes joining on YouTube, possibly up to 10. So if you just want to let me know where you're joining from, what grade you're in, I'll be happy to pass along as many questions as we can. John, if you want to come out of screen share so we can see you again when we're taking questions, that would be great. But let us start with Miss Short's class. If you guys want to kick us off with a question. Hey, Miss Short's group.
Oh, hi.
Hi, do you guys have a question to kick us off?
One second. Our student's coming up.
Take your time.
Okay, so my question is, how does a doctor tell between what's a good bacteria and a bad bacteria?
That's a great question. So this is something we're now trying to figure out, because before people would look to say, you can do some tests that are actually fairly straightforward. You can say, oh, this bacteria, which looks like this, is here. We think this usually causes some sort of sickness, so this must be a bad bacteria. Or we can do a test and find out, oh, this bacteria doesn't look like a bacteria we normally know cause disease. This must be a not bad bacteria. We're finding out now that's not quite as easy as we thought before, because a lot of times good bacteria can pick up traits from bad bacteria, so they can start to do certain bad things. Or good or even just neutral bacteria can sometimes have bad effects on people with things like, if they're immunocompromised, or if they're already sick, or if they're very old or very young. So realistically, what we try to do is, for doctors, they'll try to do some tests to whittle down, to sort of narrow down what might be going on. If they find a bacteria they know causes disease in a lot of people, they might sort of do some tests and then try to figure out if that's actually what's causing it or not. Realistically, what you can do a lot of times is, depending on how sick the person is, you can do much more specific tests and they just take a little bit longer. So there's actually a lot of sort of decision making to go into how quickly do we need to know, how serious is this, how clear is it? Is this something that always causes disease or only causes disease certain times? And then go from there, which is, I think, a little bit unsatisfying, which is why a lot of researchers are working on it right now.
Yeah, well, that's what's really neat about this topic in general, is that this is something that like literally thousands and thousands of people around the world are working on. It's a really interesting time to be in science in this field. Thank you. It's a great question to kick us off, guys. All right, Miss Gill's class, if you guys want to come up, go for it.
What is the most unique and different bacteria you have seen or heard about?
This is it's a loaded question, because I feel like if I say any one bacterium, there's going to be a lot of people who would give me an angry comment.
We promise not to from us.
Yeah. I'm going to do a potentially, let's see here. This will take me a second. I think some of the bacteria that live in really extreme environments are really surprising a lot of times, because not only do they kind of, again, living in a hot spring with a really low, sort of high acidity, not only kind of difficult because it burns us or hurts us or things like this, but it's also just incredible to think about it from sort of like a basic biology standpoint. So it's really cool to think about bacteria that have adapted to live in really, really what we call extreme environments, and that's just the only place they can survive. It's also really cool, so things, they're called extremophiles, so places that live either really deep in the ocean under extremely high pressure, things that live in, again, really high temperatures or really high salt. It's not only cool to think about them in terms of like, oh, look, they live in an extreme place on Earth, but it also kind of makes you think about what the basic requirements are for life across any environment. And it also helps you think about, like, if we end up going to a different planet or a different environment, will those things come with us, or can they, or will we find other things? It's really early to sort of make those projections, but I think the extremophiles are probably my favorites, to at least in terms of uniqueness and sort of weirdness, because they always surprise me.
It's a great answer, and we cover this when we do space topics too, is that people called astrobiologists will go to some of these remote, incredible places around the world, Antarctica, the high desert bottom of the ocean, and they find life living there. So we get hope from those sort of things, that if we go to other planets and moons, we can find life. So this is a neat crossover. Awesome. Let's head to Virginia. I think you guys got your mic working. So Miss Burkett's class, if you guys want to come up and demute your mic, It's not letting me do it, so just come up and wow, you all have questions. That's awesome. So again, we'll pass along John's email at the end so you guys can ask more, but let's bring up one kid in a second. And when your mic's good, you're good to go. Yep.
What is the place where you didn't find any bacteria?
Yeah, where did we not find any bacteria, John?
If I remember correctly, I think it was I want to say it was like a salt flat, or maybe it was a salt flat around something else. It was not only like a very small place, but it was a very specific place between two other extreme environments. So I want to say it was, if you email me, I can try to find the paper to send it to you just to make sure. But it was basically a place where I want to say it was very hot and very dry and also very salty.
Yeah.
I'll just verify that for you.
Please do. That's fantastic. No, salty is great. It's something that I think a lot of people assume salt, goes in your food. It's good, but salt flats and really salty habitats are really hard to live in for animals, for anything. So yeah.
For sure. Yeah.
All right. Let me take a question from a group on YouTube. Again, we've got a whole bunch of classes joining in there, so thank you guys so much. We've got Miss Jaster's class, grade 8 in New Albany in Ohio, and they wanted to ask, are bacteria classified by their shapes? You sort of covered this a little bit, but can you tell us about bacterial shapes?
Yeah, so historically, people have tried to classify bacteria by their shapes. So you can have either very round or spherical bacteria. There are rod-shaped bacteria. There are bacteria that are, like I showed before, kind of helical or spirally. You can classify bacteria by that, but we're finding out that that's not necessarily the most important thing about bacteria. Also, sometimes under certain conditions, bacteria might change their shapes. So if I showed you Vibrio fischeri, if you mess with certain parts of its outer membrane or its cell wall, so that the outside parts of those cells, they'll change shapes quite dramatically. So in real life, if you were just to stress out some bacteria, sometimes they'll change shapes or they might get really, really long. So it's useful if you have to do a really quick check to make a guess, like, oh, this is a rod-shaped bacteria, or this is a spherical bacteria. But really, we have much more specific ways to try to get at exactly which bacteria are there. So we can go beyond and more specifically than just shape itself.
Yeah.
But it's a really cool thing to study because, it's something we're now appreciating how much control bacteria have over their shapes.
Well, and so something you sort of touched upon briefly too earlier, which is really unique and something that we can't do as animals, is that bacteria can sort of trade their genes. They can trade their traits with other bacteria. So it's like if a person ran into a dog and wanted to be warmer on a winter day, it could like touch the dog and get some fur, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, exactly. And that's something it's really cool because bacteria sometimes, even if they're really stressed out, they'll start just trying to grab as much new material, just new DNA as they can. And it seems like an attempt to, like you said, just basically drastically shape or reshape their biology so they can survive in new environments, which is something, if I could do that, I would probably be, like 7 feet tall. I'd be able to run a lot faster. I would probably be able to jump higher or something like that.
Fantastic. Wings and spikes galore.
Wings and spikes.
Let's head to Smith's class. Come on up, guys. Yep. Good to go. Yep. Hi.
Okay.
Is everyone dabbing in the background?
Everyone's dabbing in the background. Yes, you guys. But let's make sure your classmate gets to ask this question, okay?
Okay, so what do you think is a bacteria which affects a human the most and how?
Ooh.
So I think if you look for a single bacterium that affects humans in a positive way, it's hard because everyone has such different bacteria. So our microbiotas are so different that saying just one is the most important is really hard to do. And we're finding out we can actually do experiments in lab where we can take things called germ-free animals, which have no bacteria, give them just one type of bacteria and see what effects they have. And we're finding out that those experiments are really dramatic a lot of times, but they're not exactly the same as what we normally have, which is, again, a huge, thousands of different types of bacteria doing lots of different things. So it's probably easier to find a single bacteria that does something negative in the most dramatic way. So it may not affect us individually, but historically, there have been a lot of really, really big disease epidemics that have come through from a bacteria and caused huge shifts in population. So Black Plague is one, Yersinia pestis. Nowadays, there is a bacteria called Mycobacterium tuberculosis, which you may have heard of, causes tuberculosis. If I remember correctly, that infects a couple billion people around the world. So if you're looking at kind of modern day, what single type of bacteria or single, I guess, closely related family of bacteria affects the most people in their day-to-day lives, that may be it. However, with that being said, a lot of those people that are affected with Mycobacterium tuberculosis don't get sick. So it's kind of hard to say, even then, if it's having a huge impact on all their lives or if it's sort of will have over the course of their lives, even though it makes some of them very sick.
Yeah. Again, all these answers, these questions are great questions, but they're complicated answers because we're learning so much and so much is changing. So
Exactly.
all right, let me take a question from Miss Guett's class on YouTube. So they are in Cambridge, Ontario. In fact, we seem to have all of Cambridge, Ontario in today between YouTube and live. And so they wanted to ask, do sea creatures have bacteria too, even though they live in the water?
Well, for sure. Yeah, that's actually something that's really interesting is that there are lots of bacteria that live in the ocean and seem like, or lots of ocean and ponds and streams and rivers and things like this. So lots of bacteria live just in the water and seem to be perfectly fine living in the water by themselves. But there are also a lot of bacteria that live in and with other creatures. So both the animals and the plants, even if you go really, really deep down into parts again, into the extreme parts of the ocean. And it seems like there are different bacteria than what we might find in animals and plants that live on the surface, which isn't that surprising. But again, it seems like a lot of these bacteria do really important things for those animals, just like they do for us. Yeah. So we actually don't study, or a lot of people have been studying surface animals because they're easier to access a lot of times. But there is a lot of interest in things like what the microbiota of certain commercial fish, for example, might have, or even how certain bacteria might benefit sea creatures. So like I mentioned before, this Hawaiian bobtail squid, which is a really cool, tiny little squid. It's basically about the size of like an avocado, well, actually, an avocado pit. It has a bacteria that lives inside it most of the time, and that bacteria does really important things. Like, so Vibrio fischeri makes light for these animals. Yeah. And even though we think that that's kind of a special relationship between a bacteria and an animal, we have reasons to believe that those types of relationships exist on lots of different sea creatures. So they definitely also have bacteria associated with them.
Very cool. All right, let's go to Miss Huxley's group, and then we'll do a whole other round of questions after that. So Miss Huxley's class, come on up.
Oh dear, she's coming, she's coming.
Does every human body have the same kind of bacteria, or does everyone have different kinds of them?
Yeah, so there are some bacteria that are more common across lots of different people than others. So some people, so I guess the easy answer to say is that everyone's bacteria is different than every other person's bacteria. There are some things that they might share, or some things that a lot of people share. But if you look at just all the bacteria in one person compared to all the bacteria in another person, they're different, at least every single time we've been able to study. Now, some people will have bacteria or groups of bacteria that are more similar. So there might be, like if you have an identical twin that you live with, your bacteria may be more similar than it would be with you and someone across the world. But there's still lots of there's still lots of differences between people. We're not totally sure exactly if those different, or which of those differences is most important. So we're not sure if different groups of bacteria can do the exact same thing for different people. But at least if you just look to see, like overall, let's list all the bacteria in this person, all the bacteria in this person, they're different between every single person.
Very neat. Great follow-up question on that from, again, a Cambridge class, a different Cambridge class joining on YouTube. So Miss Hummel's group, how do bacteria get to these different parts of your body? You said that your gut bacteria are different from your face or from your eyes. So how do they get there?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, bacteria live everywhere. And it seems like bacteria living everywhere can kind of, just because there's lots of them, end up getting to a lot of places, especially things like skin. I saw a study a while ago where they looked at the bacteria at different parts in someone's face. And you can see, for someone who wears glasses like me, the bacteria that I think that lived on this part of his nose, so like right here in the bridge, was very close to this part of his glasses. There's also very close to his hand. And the reason is because he did this a lot. So like I do. So a lot of times it's just through direct contact between things. Now you think about how bacteria might get inside you, so how it might get your intestines. A lot of times they either come in through food or even just through sort of normal day-to-day life. So like, for example, babies, if you look at the bacteria that live inside babies, those change dramatically right after they're first born. And it looks like a lot of those bacteria do just come in from the environment around them. So basically a lot of bacteria can rush in because there are very, very few, if any, bacteria inside a newborn baby. Bacteria coming from the environment. And then some may be able to still live there for a long time. Some will probably just live there for a second and get washed out eventually. And over time, you sort of build up this more complicated relationship between bacteria that are well suited to live inside people or live in that specific part of your body, and then some that aren't well suited to live there and just end up disappearing.
Fantastic. Well, I'm going to take a few more questions sort of at random because John has provided his email address so you guys can follow up later. So I think I'll take 3 more questions, 2 live and 1 from YouTube. I'm going to go to Miss Gill's class. If you guys want to come up and ask one, go for it. Hi.
Have you ever cured an animal that has had bad bacteria in it?
Yeah. So this is one point when I mentioned that sometimes things like antibiotics can wipe out good bacteria. I didn't mean to say something like that antibiotics are bad. That's definitely not true. So antibiotics a lot of times are able to help cure bad bacteria from animals. Now, there are some bad bacteria that are resistant to certain antibiotics, which is also a bit problematic because, you know, if someone has a bad bacteria or if an animal has a bad bacteria that is resistant to an antibiotic, giving them that antibiotic won't be able to kill that bacteria. But at least in my research, we use antibiotics a lot of times to get rid of lots of different bacteria, so good and bad altogether. And in that case, it is sometimes you can either get rid of all the bad bacteria, or you can at least get rid of enough bad bacteria that the immune system, so the defenses of the person or the animal themselves, can take over and get rid of the rest. And that's kind of the hope for a lot of medicine or a lot of medical treatments, is that you can get to a place where you can kill enough bad bacteria using either antibiotics or some other treatment like that to help the animal or the person kind of get the rest of the way to being fully healthy.
Fantastic. All right. Ms. Jasters, again, the honors class wanted to ask, what's the difference between a virus and a bacteria? I really want this question to be asked. This is great.
Yeah. So viruses are also very, very small. Those are the things that they're actually typically a little bit smaller than bacteria, although not all the time. And viruses are a little bit different because viruses need a host in order to live. So I showed you bacteria, they can live either outside or inside of a host, or they can live in different hosts. And viruses need to live inside of a host cell because they actually can't copy themselves. They can't make more viruses without a host cell. So that's one of the biggest sort of functional differences. Besides being small, viruses and bacteria actually don't have that much in common. And interestingly enough, so we can get sick from viruses, including things like the flu. Bacteria can also get sick from viruses. So there's a lot of really, really cool viruses called bacteriophages, which are viruses that are able to infect bacteria, just like some viruses can infect people or animals and things like this. So the biggest thing they get together is, or the biggest thing they share is that they're both very small, viruses and bacteria. Viruses, however, always need a host in order to live, whereas some bacteria can live with a host. Sometimes they can live outside a host, and sometimes they can do both. And then besides that, yeah, viruses and bacteria are very, very different from one another.
Okay. Fantastic. All right. I lied. I'm going to take 2 more quick ones if we can, but I love this question written in. So Miss Short's class, and then I'll head to Miss Burkett's class. So Miss Short's group, come on up and ask away.
Ready. What's a microbiome?
Yeah, so you mentioned, I think in my initial title, I mentioned that I was going to talk about the microbiome, and then I think in the slides I put down microbiota. So a lot of times people use those sort of interchangeably, where they mean about the same thing. Technically, the microbiome is, instead of talking about the bacteria themselves, you talk about all the DNA or all the genes that those bacteria have collectively. So it's a little bit more detailed in terms of what you're actually describing. It would be like, instead of calling yourself a person, you could talk about your whole genome, so all the DNA that you have in your body, and just use, I guess, that as a description for what you are. However, if you hear about someone talking about changes in the microbiota or the microbiome, usually they're referring to the same thing, which is a change in all the small things that live inside and outside of us. But they're very related terms.
All right. And then last but not least, let's head back to Virginia. Burkett's class. I was able to demute you this time for some reason, so you're good to go whenever you're ready.
What are parasites made out of?
What are parasites made out of? Yeah.
So there's actually a couple of different definitions of parasites. A parasite, technically, is any organism that benefits from living with another organism while hurting that other organism. So it's anything that basically has a positive relationship for one organism and a negative relationship for another. So parasites can be made of all kinds of things. You can have parasites like plants that live on other plants and steal some nutrients from them. You can have parasites like bacteria or small organisms that live inside us that either make us sick or take some sort of nutrients from us. So it's kind of hard to say what they're made of because they can be made up of so many different things. Interestingly, I guess sometimes we think about parasites as always being bad, but some people can live with parasites and totally be fine. And this is something we're now also trying to study, is how sometimes parasites don't act like parasites. They act as just a neutral thing that lives with another organism. And that's really interesting because if we can get things that normally act like parasites, so organisms that usually harm another organism, to stop harming the organism, we can basically kind of cure the patient or the person that has a parasite without having to kill the parasite necessarily.
Neat. This has been as fun for me as I think it is for the classes, so thank you so much for this, John. Before we wrap up, in addition to classes being able to send you direct questions, is there any resources we can send classes to learn more about bacteria, about parasites, about their microbiome? Where can we direct kids?
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of unsatisfyingly, I think Wikipedia is really, really useful if you find something you want to look at. And I know this is, I don't want to get in trouble with your teachers because I think a lot of times Wikipedia gets in trouble for being kind of a go-to resource. But if you just want to look up some quick questions about something, a lot of times it's a really great thing to really quickly check out. And then as for, there are some books, if you really like to read, there's some really, really cool books about sort of the history of microbiology or the history of certain types of microbiology. So there's things like how people track down what causes new diseases. So I think, let me try to think. One book, if you're interested in kind of finding out more about how certain, I guess it's a virus, but how certain things make us sick, I would look up a book called The Hot Zone.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, besides that, it's a little bit hard because there's so much cool research going on in microbiology that there's no longer sort of one definitive, like, go to this textbook or this source. But if you're interested in very specific parts, you can, again, definitely email me and I'll find you some things that will kind of explain like big important concepts or might connect you to something else that's interesting. Because I think anything you read will probably be updated or outdated pretty quickly. So you kind of have to just get into as much as you can as quickly as you can.
Fantastic. I always recommend too, and the sort of the impetus for getting this is Ed Yong's book, I Contain Multitudes, is a really, really fantastic book. So I'll pass along a research for that for some of our kids as well. But John, this has been great. What we do at the end of every one of our sessions is I'm going to demute every class's microphones. And so boys and girls, if you guys could get ready to join me in saying a huge thank you to John for joining us from LA today. You are all now demuted. Go for it. Thank you so much. Thank you so They're crazy. They're crazy. Thank you so much to all our class for joining today. We really, really appreciate it. We'll see you all again soon. And John, thanks so much again. This was really fantastic.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks so much for listening and for talking. I really appreciate it.